Sorry again for the downtime, guys. I'm still doing my best to wrap my head around Blender, and once again, any help would be greatly appreciated. I'm determined to do better by any means necessary. However, I was recently reminded of another infestation on my Facebook wall that's been around for at least the past year, one that I've been meaning to address for a while now, so I thought I'd make another video to re-establish my presence. I'm starting to realize that when a word becomes a buzzword, it ceases to have any salient meaning in context. People just seem to forget that these words have definitions and treat them as if they're nondescript insults, along the lines of stupid head or poopy face. I've actually been called an SJW more than a few times now, by SJWs, in a very childhood playground, I am rubber, you are glue manner of retort. And these days, it seems that the term terrorist is no different. I'm sure most of you have seen images like this circulating out there, the implication being that white people see all Muslims, and only Muslims, as terrorists. They may not directly say as much here, but anyone who has seen images like this one popping up as often as I have will also notice that not a single one of them didn't feature the face of a demented white male, as if they're the only other demographic capable of killing in cold blood. And in a limited capacity, ever since those airliners collided with the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, they are correct about the national mindset. Limited insofar as it was never only white people thinking this way, and it was certainly never all white people thinking this way. But is this man actually a terrorist? And let me make one thing perfectly clear. I am not disputing this statement in defense of his race, nor do I even remotely condone what he's done. Terrorist or not, Devin Kelley was a fucking monster, and he deserves to be buried beneath the prison wherein he would have otherwise spent the rest of his days. But as I have said several times before, I am interested in retaining a coherent definition of words, because the first step in productive discourse is to come to an agreement on the terms that we use. That is the difference between intelligent debate and mindless shit-slinging wherein we aren't even having the same discussion. It is true that the early days post 9/11 were plagued by a slew of emotional, reactionary jackasses calling French fries freedom fries out of some asinine protest of France's disagreement with the American militarized response in 2003, and who seemed dead set on assaulting any brown person they caught wearing a turban in public. It was a time that saw more than a few innocent Indian Sikhs endure the irrational prejudice of a terrorized populace thirsty for revenge. But you don't fight one wave of ignorance and stupidity with another, because it seems to me that to do so is to create a sort of social oscillating effect, striking each wave at the crest of its popularity with something just as stupid in the opposite direction until the resonance leaves everyone screaming at each other, no one listening, and civilization breaking at the seams. This is how atrocities happen. It was around that time of social upheaval that the word terrorist really started to gain its modern stigma, because it was the word officially used by our government as they addressed the 9/11 attacks. If their goal had been primarily to stir up outrage and panic, the word murderers, or even mass murderers, would have been poignant and evocative enough. It's not as if we don't automatically exile murderers from society when we find them, and that word would have been more than sufficient to sow the seeds of a violent us versus them response if that had been their intention. But that wasn't their intention, not if the government was actually doing its job and keeping the peace. So they chose an operative term, one that highlights the intent behind their actions and suggests how we should go about resisting it by not giving in to fear. A terrorist, by definition, is someone who seeks to sow terror and disarray in society specifically with the intent of exploiting it to the satisfaction of a higher political agenda. If the only purpose of a murderer is in ending the lives of his or her victims, then whether or not said victims are afraid is ultimately irrelevant. Conversely, it is entirely possible to spread fear and panic as a terrorist without taking a single life, so long as you can still convince the people that your threat is credible. A murderer can be a terrorist, and a terrorist can be a murderer, but the two are not synonymous and do not necessarily go hand in hand. Is a serial killer a terrorist? Well, technically, if their actual goal is to incite fear, but in those cases, it usually isn't so much about a higher agenda, let alone a political one, as it is about immortalizing their name in infamy. And if they're acting alone, as most serial killers do, whatever agenda they were trying to fulfill will end as soon as they are either caught or killed, because they would leave no one behind to act on their behalf. We don't live in a world where jigsaw copycats are a regular occurrence. Okay, how about an armed robber? Well, again, technically, if they were to take hostages. In that moment, you might think to call them a terrorist. Whether or not they murder anyone, they would still be using that fear to force people into compliance. But there's really no political agenda. In fact, there's no agenda at all beyond attaining whatever they sought out to steal, and certainly not one for which they'd want to claim responsibility either personally or on behalf of any ideal they may or may not stand for. Usually, their goal is to get the money and get out as cleanly as possible without being traced. The sooner people forget about it, the less time they have to spend laying low, the sooner they can start spending their ill-gotten gain. Context matters, and regardless of how that word makes you feel, you do not get to dictate what that word means, nor do you get to tell other people what they mean when they use that word. The dictionary definition simply states, a person who uses unlawful violence and intimidation, especially against civilians, in the pursuit of political aims. However, as I've said before, a dictionary definition is descriptive, not proscriptive, and from time to time it requires a revision to more accurately relay its common use. More often than not, that revision is going to involve expansion on a point it already made. The most important point in this definition is going to be in pursuit of political aims, and an act of bigotry alone is not sufficient to meet this definition unless it aims to deliver a message of grievance or a demand for change to society itself and the powers that be. Moreover, once again, a violent political statement made alone loses all potency the moment that lone threat is neutralized, and it is on its failure to acknowledge this observation that this definition needs review and a slight revision, because representation of an organized front is key more often than not. Though a terrorist can act alone, they typically don't. There are exceptions, of course, like Unabomber Ted Kaczynski. He was uniquely equipped to terrorize society alone in such a way that allowed him to evade capture for 17 years. In that time, he attacked on 16 different occasions, and his manifesto released to the Washington Post and the New York Times left his motives entirely unambiguous. His attacks were definitively about delivering a message concerning the effects of the Industrial Revolution and his fears for a future that relies too heavily on technology, not about carnage for the sake of carnage. He was a mathematical prodigy, and his fanatical vision of the future drove him to forego a successful career in favor of inciting mayhem. And with how effective he was at what he did, and how specific the message behind it, nobody who has heard of him is going to forget it anytime soon, especially those who lived through the fear of knowing he was still at large. However, most people are not like Ted Kaczynski, and therefore most terrorists are not like Ted Kaczynski. Most terrorists could not do it alone. So in most conversations about actual terrorism, the word terrorist is usually reserved for people who act on the behalf of an organization that holds a particular set of ideals which they wish to see satisfied in society. And as such, they claim responsibility for their actions on behalf of that organization in order to present a looming threat and encourage compliance with those ideals. But the fact of the matter is that the people on the left who are making these images, just like the people on the right who responded so violently over a decade and a half ago, don't really care what that word actually means. They only do this because they want to weaponize the feeling that particular buzzword evokes, and use it to redirect the focus toward white people for what they believe to be a racial issue. And if either side of this argument was using that term correctly most of the time, they would understand that it isn't, and the word wouldn't have lost so much of its meaning when we hear it spoken today. Yes, there are white terrorists. If a Christian sect firebombs an abortion clinic in a collective observation of a particular interpretation of Scripture, and if they do so in order to send a message about the supposed immorality of abortion, then we would call these people terrorists regardless of the color of their skin. If the members of an animal rights coalition kill people's pets and throw buckets of red paint onto people wearing fur coats, and if they do so to send a message about the ethical treatment of animals, then we would call these people terrorists regardless of the color of their skin. And if a group of radical jihadists cut off a man's head and broadcast the footage to the public, and if they do so in observation of their interpretation of the teachings of Islam and their abhorrence of Western culture, then we would call these people terrorists regardless of the color of their skin. Like it or not, the main ideological enemies of the West that employ terrorism are radical jihadist cells originating from the Middle East, not from any homegrown organization in the West. And since Islam just so happens to be practiced most regularly in a part of the world where there are very few white people, most of the terrorist faces we will see are not going to be white at this particular juncture in history. So let's recap. A terrorist is a person who uses violence or intimidation tactics to the end of satisfying a political agenda. The term terrorism is not in reference to any specific action, but in reference to the intent behind the action. Whether or not their actions incite fear is only relevant to the definition of that word insofar as what they believe is to be gained or provoked from that fear. It is not your feelings that give that word its meaning, but the communication of their agenda. And lastly, while it is not absolutely pivotal to the definition, it is a noteworthy observation that terrorists most often will not act alone, because acting as a unified front increases their threat and expands their sphere of influence. They tend to unite under a common name and banner representing a set of ideals, for the notion that an idea can neither be arrested nor killed. For example, Al-Qaeda, PETA, ISIS, Antifa. So, was Devin Kelley a terrorist? No, he wasn't. Devin Kelley was a disturbed and violent man who left no concrete indication of his motives. He made no demands, he did not act on the behalf of any specific special interest group or demographic, and he neither communicated nor left behind any manifesto that outlined any sort of political agenda. He acted of his own accord, and his motives were evidently personal. Even CNN, a news outlet that could not possibly be more at odds with Donald Trump and his administration, a news outlet that could not be more complacent in supporting the white privilege victim narrative spewing from the left, have been sifting through Kelley's personal life for any scrap of evidence of someone to blame that aligns with their personal predisposition. And to absolutely no avail, to the point where they have defaulted once again to pointing the finger at our current standard of gun regulations, because they can find no one and nothing else to blame. It should be noted that these people still default to the KKK when referring to an organized form of white supremacy, even though they have not been a credible threat for decades. And I promise you, they would happily replace them with a more contemporary face of white evil in an official capacity if they could. If there was any white supremacist agenda behind Kelley's actions, especially on the behalf of any current organization claiming responsibility, they would have gleefully pointed it out. But there isn't one. Not every psychopath firing a rifle into a crowd is a terrorist, regardless of the color of their skin. A killer can easily desire to murder people without caring one way or the other if their victims were afraid, let alone attempting to gain anything from that fear. We need to stop turning everything into a fucking racial issue. And if we're to make any progress towards actual solutions, we need to start by agreeing on the terms. There was once a time when proponents of both the left and the right understood this. But ever since that fateful day, and especially since the rise of this social justice doublethink, we have seen any semblance of productive discussion go up in smoke. How the fuck are we supposed to take an actual stand against terrorism as a whole if we are too busy dividing up terrorists and assigning them to other camps based on the color of their skin? How does that not simply feed the fire and promote terrorism out of petty and shallow racial loyalties? Further, anyone who tries to talk sense into these idiots in person is liable to wind up the victim of one of their violent riots precisely because of this stupid line of thinking. Which is why we constantly see places like Berkeley, California setting the streets on fire in their fervor for punching Nazis to the end of silencing anyone who disagrees with them. So it seems that it's now up to the so-called centrists, such as myself, with channels and other digital platforms like mine, to attempt to preserve the voice of reason. I say now what I said in my first video. We need as many people as possible speaking out against this crap as we can muster. And if you are outspoken about your opinion like I am, if you are prone to leaving novel-length comments decrying these people as I was, please start a channel of your own and throw your hat into the ring. Even if I don't agree with you on all points, I would still acknowledge your efforts to bring all of this nonsense to a favorable resolution. I may be a helping hand, but I'm only one man, and all of us who have taken up this fight need all of the help we can get. As always, my crowdfunding and social media links are listed in the description for those who wish to show your support or relay your concerns. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in my next video. Thanks for watching, guys. If you like what you saw here, have a look at my other videos and leave me your thoughts in the comments. If you support my message, then please like, favorite, and subscribe. If you'd like to help this channel improve, you can reach out to me on Twitter or on Facebook with any suggestions. And if you'd like to support me more directly, please consider following me on Patreon. Links in the description. Thanks again, and I'll catch you all in my next video.